Hi, my name is David Bose. I am the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center, and welcome to this special edition of our Solutions Series, a virtual edition, which we've been having every week to highlight key issues that Washington Policy Center has been working on. Today, we'll be hearing from Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director, who's going to be speaking about whether science actually matters to policymakers anymore. We'll talk about how science is being used to push an ideological agendas, and how that undermines the very the confidence and objectivity of public officials and the confidence that the public has in science. What's going to happen and the way this will work is I'll bring Todd on the screen here in just a few seconds, and Todd will give a presentation. He has a PowerPoint presentation to give. And while that presentation is going on, if you have any questions for Todd related to this or any of the other topics that he's written about on the blog at washingtonpolicy.org, you can ask those questions in the question section, the toolbox there. The GoToWebinar toolbox on the right-hand side of your screen. Just type in the question there, and I'll be assembling those questions for the Q&A after Todd's presentation. Your other option is to use my email, dbose, D as in David, B as in boy, O, Z as in zebra, E as in egg, dbose@washingtonpolicy.org. So I'll be collecting questions from both of those locations, the GoToWebinar question box there, and my email address, and we'll use those during the Q&A. Also, I want you to note in the chat function, there's a couple of articles from Todd that you're going to be provided that you'll be able to read and take a look at related to this presentation. There's also going to be a link to Todd's recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal related to today's topic. So Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director, will be joining us now. Todd, why don't you take it away?
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. So this is, it's a little strange to be talking about this because we've just gone through a period of time where we've seen one of the biggest capitulations of science to politics in a long time, with the change in the quarantine and the rules about social distancing basically going away overnight for a political reason. But science is very important in how we make political and how we make decisions, good public policy decisions, because otherwise what ends up happening is that it's all subjective. People do what they want. And the biggest problem is the people who pay the price for that failure, for the failure when you ignore science and do public policy and spend lots of money and put regulations. The people who pay that price are not the politicians. And so we have to find a way to ground the political discussions that we have and the political decisions that we make in science. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we do that and our failure to do it so far. So I like this Dilbert cartoon, which I'm sure that we've all had similar experience with, where somebody challenges you to say, okay, I want to see your study, or I want to see your facts, and then you show it to them and they still don't care. And the reason is that people have incentives to ignore facts that are not on their side. And they say things constantly that don't reflect what is actually going on. And I have several examples of this. So the first one is that we hear in Washington State about climate change, and that we have a climate crisis or a climate emergency. And one of the things that people constantly point to is the loss of snowpack. And so these are just two examples from this year. One is from House Bill 2311. 2311 set targets for CO2 reductions for Washington State to reduce the impact of climate change on Washington State. We can set aside the fact for now that even if we meet these targets, it will do literally nothing to impact snowpack. But in the prelude, it has this line. It says, our state is experiencing a climate emergency in the form of lack of snowpack. Investigate West, which is a left-wing sort of online news organization, put out also a guide for journalists on climate change. And one of the things that they say is that winter snowpacks in the Cascades are already visibly shrinking. Interestingly, they didn't provide a link to any sort of data behind that claim that they're visibly shrinking, but they made that, and they argue that that is a reason that we have to look at taking serious and expensive efforts to stop climate change. So this is what we've been told. What is the truth? Well, in fact, the snowpack has been above what they call normal for 12 of the last 15 years. So far from declining, our snowpack has actually been above normal for most of the time. And these are data from the United States Department of Agriculture, where they do testing every single day. And just in 2020, we were once again above normal. What's so interesting about this year is that in January, we were far below normal. And there were all sorts of articles in January about how we were never going to recover, that it was impossible for us to recover the snowpack and get to normal. And we ended up actually above normal. So despite the fact that we have had above normal snowpack for 12 of the last 15 years, you still hear this constant mantra that we are losing our snowpack, that it is already visibly declining, and that's just nonsense. It's just not true. There's another example recently this year. So when we had the coronavirus shutdown, people started saying, "Oh my God, this is very bad, and it's horrible to the economy." But isn't it great that we are seeing some environmental benefits from the shutdown, because people aren't driving, there isn't traffic, and so our air is so much cleaner. And there are two examples. So Lieutenant Governor Cyrus Habib tweeted out, Washingtonians across the state have noticed something different about our air lately. It's cleaner. So in other words, we can see how much cleaner our air is. And Fawn Sharp, who's an environmental activist on climate change, was quoted in the Seattle Times saying, "People can physically see the difference in the cleaner air." So here are two people both in April saying, yeah, the shutdown is hard economically, but the fact that we can see the benefits to clean air shows what we can achieve environmentally, right? They weren't just saying these as observations, they were saying these because they wanted to give an example of, look what can be done if we put our minds to it to clean the air. So I decided to take a look at the data. And in fact, what you find is that the air isn't really cleaner. So the top chart on the right there is Seattle, Tacoma, and Bellevue. The blue line is this year, and the gray is the average of the last 5 years. And you see it go up and down, and sometimes it's above and sometimes it's below. But basically, it's the same as we've had for the last, and it's very close to the average for the last 5 years. Below is Spokane and Spokane Valley, and you can see that it almost tracks perfectly the 5-year average ever since the shutdown toward the end of March. So the claim that our air quality, and this is for particulate matter, ozone is another thing that we track, but ozone is much more a summertime problem, and we don't have problems with ozone in Washington State. Particulate matter, on the days that we have bad air quality, it's because of particulate matter. And by the way, it's not because of cars, it's typically because of wood burning stoves. So, and the data show that our air is not in fact cleaner. I looked nationwide, I actually wrote a piece for National Review looking nationwide, and you see the same thing across the country. There are some places that are better. New York is better. It's obvious that the air quality is improved, but places like Phoenix are worse. So there's no clear trend one way or the other. And the reason that this is important is that we hear constantly that we need to do this regulation or that regulation because it will clean the air. The low carbon fuel standard this year, which would have added about 15 cents to the price of a gallon of gas, over the first decade, if we use data from Oregon and California, claimed it would have improved air quality, particulate matter. And in fact, that was the #1 claim that they made. They sort of stopped claiming that it would reduce CO2 emissions very much and started focusing on particulate matter. But in light of the fact that here we've had this massive shutdown, traffic is less, we haven't had much of an impact. You have to sort of wonder, would we really see a benefit from things like the low carbon fuel standard and other very expensive regulatory policies with regard to air quality? I'll give another example. There's a lot of fight about the Snake River dams, and there are folks who are pushing to tear down the 4 Snake River dams, and the reason that they argue is that the salmon runs are declining. They actually talk about how imperiled they are, they're in danger of going away, and other things like that. But if you look at the trend from 1975, you can actually see that the trend is upward. There are some big cycles. So you can see in the early 2000s, there was a big increase, and then it went way down again. And then we saw a big increase in the middle of this last decade. And right now we're at a low point. But that's typical to the cycle that we saw last time. And I was just checking the data this morning, and we are a little bit ahead of last year for Chinook Run for the Lower Granite Dam, which is the farthest upstream. So the data that they claim about the Snake River are simply not true. There is a cycle. We are at a down point right now, but on the whole, we are moving in the right direction. It is not true with Puget Sound. Puget Sound salmon are either declining or basically staying flat. And I have 3 charts here up through this year. So the one on the far left is Snoqualmie. You can see that the levels on the Snoqualmie are basically what they were 40 years ago. The middle is the Skagit, is the upper Skagit. Skagit is one of the largest runs in the Puget Sound, and you can see the same sort of thing, that it's basically the same as it was 40 years ago. There was a peak in the mid 2000s, but we've gone back basically to where we were 40 years ago. And the Green River, the Duwamish, not surprisingly, that comes out at Seattle, it's down. So we are lower levels than we were 40 years ago. So if you're concerned about orca and salmon recovery, if you're a sport fisher, if you're a commercial fisher, if you're worried about orca, or if you're just worried about salmon for the sake of salmon, then the place that you should be concerned about is not the Snake River, it's Puget Sound. We're doing a lot on the Snake River to try to recover salmon. Where it's not working is Puget Sound. And this is an important aspect of how science integrates with policy. Science should help us prioritize those things that make the biggest difference, where you can put your time, resources to achieve the goal that you want to achieve. And if the goal we want to achieve is recovering salmon to feed orca, then Puget Sound is where you want to do it, because we're not making progress there. And the Puget Sound Partnership agrees. So they have this progress statement that says we're not improving, and the status of Chinook is below our 2020 target. We will not meet the 2020 target that they had for increased salmon populations. So the question is why? What's going on? So last week, I'm a member of the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council. We met with the Salmon Advisory Group, which is a number of scientists, and they're putting together a study to try to figure out why we haven't achieved the goals or made the progress that we thought we would make. And they have a number of different hypotheses. One is that we're doing the right things, it just takes longer than we expected. Another is that we haven't done enough. The third is we're not doing the right things in the right places. So that prioritization that I talked about earlier, it could be that we simply have focused on the wrong watersheds. So that's another thing. It could be that we are making progress, but other things are offsetting that progress. Other inputs, loss of buffers along streams, so the streams get hot, which is bad for fish, things like that. Or it could be just, we just don't have enough information. We just don't know. So all of those things are hypotheses. Here's the problem with that. Politicians are not typically scientists. And so when there is scientific uncertainty, the way they deal with that is that they turn to alternative justifications for different policies. So if you're a politician and you say, okay, why aren't we meeting our goals? And then they say, well, it could be one variety of things. And they say, well, what should we do? Which projects should we support? And how much should we spend to achieve those goals? The scientists are likely to say, it's unclear. Wait, right, it could be this, it could be this. And here are 10 projects, and all of them are kind of equal, frankly. I mean, some are better in some areas than others, but there's trade-offs, and it's hard to distinguish. So if you're a politician, how do you deal with that? And the way politicians, especially who are not scientists, deal with that is that they look for tiebreakers that they do understand, that do benefit them. And those tiebreakers can be job creation, that they're going to choose the project that has most job creation. So I just got an email this morning from the state bragging about projects in the Chehalis Basin and for salmon recovery. And the first thing it said is it will promote job creation. Not the second thing. The very first thing it said was job creation. So what they're trying to do is to appeal to politicians who right now, understandably, care about job creation. But what that means is that if the science is a little bit murky, and to somebody all things are equal, then job creation or social justice or whatever other value you have, that's what's really making the decision, not the science on the ground, not the prioritization of science. It is these other things that they say, well, since the science is unclear and all things are equal otherwise, I can choose based on jobs and still claim to be following the science because the science is unclear. When in fact, the science is not what's making the decision for them. What's making the decision for them is social justice, jobs, other things like that. Values, this isn't entirely illegitimate. Values do play a role in how we make decisions, even when science is involved. And I'll give you an example. So when I worked at the Department of Natural Resources, we were starting to look at the marbled murrelet. Marbled murrelet is a little seabird that flies out to the ocean to eat and then flies back to the coast. They're very hard to find. Their nests are very small. We know some about them, but we don't know a ton. And so the question is, so how do we, in that environment where there's that uncertainty, how do we protect? What policy can we follow to protect the marbled murrelet? So I went down the hall and talked with a biologist who worked on the marbled murrelet and said, all right, what do you think we should do? And what she said was, we need to protect, there's habitat that we know that is suitable for the marbled murrelet. We should protect that habitat and then put a buffer around that habitat to protect, to make sure that we don't intrude on that area. So give ourselves a margin of error. So then I walked down the hall in the other direction and talked with a forester and said, all right, what do you think we should do to protect the marbled murrelet? And what he said was, well, we should manage the forest the way it has been managed naturally, right? 100 years ago, we harvested forest based on production and other things like that. Now we do it very differently. We get the production, but we manage a forest in the way that mirrors the sort of traditional pattern of fire and the balance and other things like that of the ecology, so that we have not just one type of forest, either old growth or anything else, we have this sort of mosaic of it. He said that's the natural, that's what these forests were naturally. We can harvest, we can replicate what fire did on these forests with harvest, and we should do that. So those are two very different approaches to protecting marbled murrelet. One says lock everything up and don't touch it, and another says nothing gets locked up, everything moves around, you can harvest, but it has to mirror that natural approach. And so the question is, which is right? Which is the science? And the answer is they're both science, but they are different in what risks they take and what risks they tolerate, and that is a value judgment. If you are a biologist who has studied the marbled murrelet for decades, your risk tolerance to that bird is very low. And so the science that you are going to emphasize is science that puts the lowest risk toward the bird that you care very much about. If you're a forester, you are very confident in your ability to manage the forest in a way that is typical to the way it was naturally, and you're going to be willing to take those sorts of risks in a way that a biologist is not. That's important to understand because people say follow the science. There is no the science. It is always influenced by these sorts of trade-offs and values. So let me talk a little bit about how we deal with this. My first rule of science is that when people are trying to say, okay, is this the science? Science is not divisible by 5. Anytime you see a goal that says we're following the science and it's divisible by 5, it is not science. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has this report that they put out that says that we need to keep temperatures to either 2 degrees Celsius increase or 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. I can tell you right now, not being one of the world's top climate scientists, that those numbers are not scientific because they are divisible by 5. They don't take into account the trade-offs. They simply are round numbers that are used politically so that people can remember them and then say, we must meet this goal because the scientists say so. It is absolutely untrue. The same thing was true with the low carbon fuel standard this year. The goal was to reduce carbon intensity of fuels 10% in 10 years. There's no research or science that came up with those numbers. It's because they're divisible by 10 and 5. So how do we do this? How do we deal with the fact that there's uncertainty in science, and what replaces science in times of uncertainty is politics? What we have to do is we have to align the incentives with the science. So as I've pointed out, that if you give politicians a chance to ignore the science or say, well, the science is all kind of equal, so I'm gonna choose based on my other values, they will do that because it benefits them. They get rewarded by creating jobs for special interest groups or taking policies that please special interest groups for social justice or whatever other reason. And if you give them that opportunity, they will do it. And they will still be able to claim based on the uncertainty that they're following the science. So you have to make sure that the people who are making scientific decisions have an incentive to choose the best science. So I have a picture here of my bees. There's a lot of fighting about why bees are dying, but decisions about my bees shouldn't be made by politicians who are not beekeepers and don't know what beekeeping is about or what influences the bees. They're not farmers, right? They don't rely on bees to pollinate their crops. So the way we have to make decisions about what science works for bees, why bees are dying, and how to fix that is to allow beekeepers and farmers to make those decisions. Because if you ban certain pesticides, so there's talked about banning like neonicotinoids. Neonicotinoids don't actually harm bees very much, but other pesticides do. And if you ban one type of pesticide and you go backwards to old pesticides that do harm bees, you have punished and you have harmed people who have to pay the price for that, but didn't get to make the decision about what pesticides worked. If you have bees and your farmer is using pesticides that would kill bees, one, farmers don't want to do that because they have an incentive not to do that. They have an incentive not to kill bees. But if you're worried about it, talk with that farmer and you can work out those incentives back and forth. That's the way to do this, not to make decisions, scientific decisions, not to have people who don't have a stake in the game, who don't pay the price for failure to make those scientific decisions. It's not perfect, but I can guarantee you scientific decisions that are aligned with people's incentives are going to be better than ones that are made based on distant from people who don't understand the science and have alternative incentives to please special interest groups. And with that, I will stop and see what questions we have.
Okay, well, thanks, Todd. I'm going to remind people that you can ask questions via my email, dbose@washingtonpolicy.org. That's dbose@washingtonpolicy.org. Or just go to the tool function there. This is the easiest way for your GoToWebinar tool function. There's a question area. Type in your question there, and we'll get straight to some questions from Todd. What I'm going to do, because my function here is just to relate questions, I'm going to disappear and just be like the bodiless voice asking these questions of Todd. And Todd, let's start off with, when you point out the wrong data or the abuse of data, so to speak, how does the media typically respond to you when you point out that maybe there's an error in the story or that a politician is misusing that data?
It really does vary. So on the snowpack issue or on the air quality issue, I have been largely ignored because it's so contrary to what they hear. They hear constantly that our snowpack is declining. It makes sense to them, right? They say, okay, temperatures are going up. They believe in climate change as a crisis. So how can snowpack not be declining? So they don't actually go and check the data to see whether it's true or not. They just simply say it must be true. So when I point to them the data, they kind of squint and they're not sure how to deal with it. In other circumstances, though, they are very interested. And so one of the things that I've worked on during the lockdown is testing, to look at our testing data. So, you know, the governor has an agency called Results Washington that is tracking data in a whole range of areas, and climate and environment is one of them. And so I've written for the past few years about the fact that the governor has not followed the data, his own data, on climate change. And when the data became embarrassing, they simply removed them from the webpage. So when he put up a new dashboard for the coronavirus, for COVID, I jumped on it, even though it's not my particular area. I just looked at the data rather than sort of the health or science of it, which I'm not an expert in. And what I found is that despite the fact that they were saying that testing was going up, and the governor and everybody else says we need more testing, it was actually declining throughout May. So I kept pointing this out and pointing out that their own data showed this. And we've had actually very nice traction with that. We had a front page story in the Olympian about the fact that testing was going down. We've had reporters from King 5 and the Associated Press and elsewhere ask questions using our data about testing and the fact that it's not going up. That happened just again yesterday. It happened last week. So they've been very responsive sometimes, but not in others. So, you know, you're not going to win all of them, but we just have to keep constantly reminding people, look, these are the numbers, this is the truth. And sometimes it takes more time than you'd like, but we keep making progress.
I want to follow up with you on that. Todd, do you find a difference between when you inform media of these problems and when you inform politicians? Do you find the politicians more or less receptive to data correction?
The politicians are less receptive because they have, one, no politician wants to admit that they were wrong. And so they will come up with lots and lots of rationalizations about why they weren't wrong. What we see oftentimes, though, is that they may actually never say they were wrong, but the next time they do something, they just slightly change what they do to take account of the data. So it puts pressure on them. Media, some of them have an ideological bias. There is no doubt about it. But there are a number of the media who are simply interested in a good story and things that are counterintuitive. They got into reporting because they liked learning things. And when you tell something counterintuitive, sometimes people find that exciting. And so you can find those reporters and get them to write those stories. And then that puts pressure on politicians. And the best example of that is that after a month of the governor's dashboard where he had these little dials, they scrapped that and went with a whole new system. They never would have done that if the dials weren't causing a lot of grief for them from questions from the media. So it can work. You just have to keep putting pressure on.
Next question is from a viewer who wants to know if you could give a further explanation of your rule of 5. They didn't quite understand it the first time around.
Well, so what we see in politics is that you see, we're going to reduce the low carbon fuel standard. We're going to reduce carbon intensity 10% in 10 years. So how did they choose 10%? Is that a target that is based on, okay, we need to reduce CO2 emissions this much to do this, or here's how much we estimate 10% will cost this, and that's an acceptable cost, or what is it? No, it's based on nothing. That 10% is based on that it's the number 10, that we have 2 hands, each of them that have 5 fingers. That's all it's based on. And the fact that it's 10 years, the same thing. It's a slogan. It's not science. So when you say, okay, but if you reduce it 7%, it only costs 3 cents to achieve that, and you achieve, 90% of the goal. It's sort of like the 80-20 rule, right? The 80-20 rule is that the last 20% costs you 80%. So why not do 7 or 8%? Why do 10%? Because they have done none of the analysis. 10% in 10 years is purely because it sounds good. The same thing with the 2-degree target for CO2. There is some, right? They didn't say, 10 degrees or 5 degrees. They said 2. So there is some sort of range that is an acceptable range. But they didn't say 2.2 degrees Celsius. They didn't say 1.8 degrees Celsius because they analyzed the impacts. They said 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. Those are the 2 goals because they're divisible by 5. And because they're easy to remember and because they're politically useful, not because any sort of scientific research has been done that says that those are the right targets. And you see it again and again and again in public policy. Every environmental target that they claim is backed by the science is almost always divisible by 5. I hope that answered it.
I think so. Or we'll have to try it again. Now, do you think, this is the next question, do you think that the fact that the government has allowed millions of gallons of sewage to dump into Elliott Bay via Discovery Park would be a primary reason or the primary reason for the decline in salmon in the Sound?
So it doesn't help. Let me just say that. But here you can see the trends. I'll go back to this slide with the trends of the salmon, and you can see that in the Duwamish, which is on the far right there, we have seen a decline since the early 2000s. So the sewage spills that we have seen are fairly regular, which is unfortunate. Each time they promise that they'll figure it out, and they never seem quite to. But there's a lot more going on. So it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts. It's a lot of little things. There's no single big things. One of the reasons that environmentalists point to the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act as examples of government, top-down government environmental solutions is that they worked. They worked because it was very easy to target big smokestacks and big sewage outfalls and other things into water and stop the impact of those things. They're called point sources. So the reason the Clean Water Act worked at cleaning up our water is because you could target a very small number of big impact, of things that cause big impact, and deal with them. We don't really have that anymore. We've solved those problems. And so the problems that we face now are like little bits of tire rubber, brake dust, little oil leaks that run off into Puget Sound. In the case of Orca, sound just from boats makes it difficult for the southern resident killer whales to echolocate their prey. So it's many little things. So the sewage into Puget Sound is not good. It certainly has an impact, but I would not put it toward the top or say it's the only thing. It is one of many things. It is ironic though that King County points to all these things and regulations, and at one point actually wanted to regulate septic tanks and charge people to regulate septic tanks. And when you asked, well, what is the impact of septic tanks on water? And they said, we don't really know. That's why we need regulation. At the same time, they are pouring literally millions of gallons of sewage into Puget Sound. So it's, they're focusing in the wrong place a lot of times.
Next question, can you discuss aligning incentives around climate change?
So let's say let's say I don't believe climate change is real. Personally, my feeling as Todd Myers is that CO2 does tend to increase temperatures over time, not nearly as much as the alarmists say. I think there's a lot that's way overblown, but we can actually measure that it does. But let's say I don't believe that. Let's say I think CO2 is too small, and I say, okay, fine. But if you put a Nest thermostat in your home, you're going to cut your CO2 emissions and your energy costs by 20%. Now, what do you say? Great, I'm going to do it. Let's say I say that you can buy a car and pay a little bit more, but get a lot better gas mileage, and your gasoline bill will go down. Great, I'm going to do it. Let's say that saving gasoline means we send less money to our good friends in Venezuela, Iran, and Russia. Great, we'll do it. All of those things align incentives, personal incentives, with environmental benefits. And that's where we're really actually seeing some really exciting things go on, which is that if I can create a personal incentive, if I can tie what I do personally to the environmental benefit, it's more likely to endure. Political things swing back and forth, and what you were doing at one point gets undone by the next administration. But I'll give you an example. In the United Kingdom, there is a utility called Octopus, and they charge rates based on time of day. So during peak demand, which is the late afternoon and early evening, is when the demand is highest, and when demand is highest, of course, the price goes up, and the price can go way up. In Washington State, we are largely protected from those prices, those big price swings, but there's a utility in England that says, no, we're not going to protect you. We're going to charge you a lot during the peak demand, and we'll charge you much less during other times, and encourage you to shift your demand to reduce that to lower the prices. The other thing that does is that wind power occurs primarily at night. And so there sometimes is a surplus of wind power, and it is easier for them actually to pay you to take that wind power than to shut a lot of plants down to try to deal with it, because it's more expensive to do that. And so they'll pay you like a penny a kilowatt hour. And what has happened is that I wrote about this in a piece for Reason magazine, is that all of these little innovators have come up with tools that you can use, either apps or things that you can plug a ground source heat pump into, that look at the prices and heat your home or charge your car, other things like that when prices are low. You don't have to believe in climate change. You don't have to worry about anything. All you have to do is to know that if you charge your car at 3 a.m. when there's a lot of wind power, you're going to get paid. And if you heat your house at 6 p.m. when the prices are very high, you're going to pay a lot. That's aligning incentives with environmental benefit and reduction of resources. And remember, fundamentally, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. Environmentalism is a concern about scarce resources. Those things go hand in hand. And if you can make the economics work for the environment, you will do much better over the long term to reduce our impact and create a more sustainable future. Kind of hate that phrase for a variety of reasons, but in the truest sense, be able to sustain what we're doing and benefit financially.
Next question, Todd. Wouldn't solving the Puget Sound salmon orca issue just require giving up salmon for human consumption?
So obviously there is a question about harvesting and fishing. You will hear people from time to time say things like that salmon are the only endangered species that we can still kill and eat. I don't think that's possible. I think that there's lots of other strategies that we can have. If you ask a tribe, they will say that they have a treaty right to go harvest salmon. So even if we shut down sport and commercial fishing for non-tribal members, the tribes would still have a treaty right to go out and harvest fish. So, and we have seen that on the Snake in Columbia, where the populations are going up, that we can do it. There are lots of other things that we can deal with that are more politically challenging, such as we are now reducing the amount of sea lions at the mouth of the Columbia and on the Willamette River near Portland. And that's having a positive impact. More fish are returning because we are reducing those populations. Those populations have gone way up. And as you've seen those populations go up in Puget Sound, mouth of the Columbia, Willamette, you have seen other populations of fish go down. There have been scientific studies that show that transient orcas, which are not the resident killer whale, and sea lions are the largest threat to salmon populations. So I understand that people make that argument. I don't agree with that argument. I think that there are other things that we can do. And remember that even if we shut everything down for non-tribal, the tribes would still have a right to go catch fish.
Next question. Do you think part of the problem is that reporters generally graduate with humanities degrees, leaving data collection or data analysis as a weak point?
Yeah, I think that certainly contributes. Now, I will say that I graduated with a humanities degree, but I also love data. I used to be a computer programmer, so I have that. So it's not, it's not a fatal flaw. I think more importantly, though, is a sense of curiosity. You can find two reporters, both who have degrees in English, one of whom has sort of an ideological bias, and one of whom is biased toward curiosity, right? Hearing things that are counterintuitive and wanting to write about that. And even if they both have the same sort of background, one will do a better job of highlighting these problems than the other. So I think it has more to do with that. And you just have to know sort of which reporters are which. I think that people complain constantly about the media being biased. They're definitely biased reporters, and I deal with a lot of them, especially who focus on the environment. But that's not always true. And like I said, I have gotten some good stories recently, especially about the testing on coronavirus, from reporters who were willing to challenge the governor and to point out that the data were wrong. So I think you can't use a broad brush.
Next question, why do you believe there's such a social disconnect on science? People are anti-vaccine, anti-GMO, and yet the same people will yell follow the science in other circumstances. How do you explain that?
Because the incentives because ideology overwhelms science, and science is murky. There have been a number of studies that show that the more you know about climate change, so there's this argument that says, well, if people just knew the science, they would agree with me. And so there have been studies that asked people how much they know about climate change. And what they find is that the more you know about climate change, the more polarized you become. So knowing science about climate change doesn't move people toward the left or toward the right. It moves people more in one direction or another. They become more certain. And so their own biases, their own ideological biases, drive what they see and make them more certain rather than less certain. And so that's not, again, that's not a problem of humanities, people who graduate with the humanities degree. It is a problem of everyone, because the more you know, the more certain you are you're right. It's part of humanity. That's why I say you have to align your incentives, because if you don't pay a price for being wrong, then the feedback in your brain is going to be, I'm going to choose what makes me feel good. If I decide when I'm taking care of my bees that the real problem is genetically modified crops, and so I put my bees out on an organic farm and they die every year because I don't treat them for varroa mites or other things like that, I'm paying a price for my own, lack of scientific rigor and my own stupidity. I'm more likely to say, maybe GMO isn't what the problem is here. Maybe it's something else. So that's why you have to do that. It's not a critique, right? Everybody does it. I do it. But if you can at least give people a reward for following good science, you're more likely to move them in the right direction.
Okay, next question, Todd. Is it cost effective to try to cool river temperatures? Is it beneficial versus the cost?
Yeah, you can plant trees. There's a variety of ways to do that. The first thing is, when we talk about is it beneficial, the question is who pays? A lot of what we try to do in environmental policies, we say, we need more trees on streams, and so we're going to require all farmers or people who own land on streams to plant trees and manage them. Okay, I think that's wrong. The benefit of cool streams and the benefit of having more salmon is a societal benefit. We all benefit from wanting more fish, right? If you go fishing and there's a Chinook salmon that's there that wouldn't have otherwise been there because there are cool streams, that person benefits, but somebody else is having to pay all the costs for doing that. So the first thing is that when we talk about the costs, a big part of that is who pays. So in Washington State, when we adopted the forest and fish regulation, we required bigger buffers on forests for a variety of reasons, but one of them was to have shade that cools the streams. And for small forest landowners, what we did is we said, look, you're losing harvestable timber, value to you. And since small forest landowners don't have 1 million acres, they only have, a few acres. If you take out that buffer, it could wipe out a huge amount of money of value to them. So the state says, okay, we'll pay you for 50% of the lost value. You can argue about whether that's enough. And the other problem is that we don't actually allocate very much money. So there's a long backlog, and some people don't even put into the program because they figure they'll never get paid. But theoretically, at least, that's a better approach than simply putting a regulation that says you need to put trees on your stream and manage them, and that's your fault. Sorry that you're in this position, but it's not our problem. We need to help farmers do that, or other people who have land along streams. That, I think, is a fundamental problem that we have in the way that we think about some of these things, is that it's easier just to require other people to do things and walk away. But if the benefits are societal, then society should pay also for the costs of that. And reducing stream temperatures is one thing that is important. It's something that we can do. And planting the trees is, it takes a little time, but there are a lot worse, more expensive things that we could do instead. So relatively, I think it's a good approach.
What do you think about the problem of the use of unscientific subspecies designations by environmentalist groups to violate individual property rights? Example, the Todd's driveway earthworm lives only near Todd's driveway. It must be protected. Therefore, Todd must not be allowed to drive a car.
Let me just say first, the Todd's driveway earthworm, the robins have been feasting on them this year. So they play an important role in the ecosystem. Yeah, and the even better case is the southern resident killer whales, right? If the southern resident killer whales are extirpated, it's not because we won't not have killer whales. We'll have lots of other killer whales. And in fact, transient orca, which move in and out of Puget Sound, in some ways are outcompeting the southern resident killer whales. And the reason is that southern resident killer whales have a strategy that focuses on Chinook, where the transient orca have an echolocation and hunting strategy that also allows them to eat seals. If you're a southern resident killer whale, and there's lots and lots of Chinook, as there were for a long time, that's great, until the Chinook population goes down, and now you're in trouble. So the question is that a valid recognition of a subspecies? Is that valid to say, okay, this is different from this? And the answer is that is not a scientific question. That is a values question. Is it worth it to us to keep that small, unique population as opposed to other things? And how much are we willing to pay to keep that small, unique population? That is a values question. It's not a scientific question.
Here's a related question that came in, Todd. Northern resident orcas are doing well. Is that because of a broader diet or something else?
Yes, the transient orcas eat seals and other things like that because they use a different strategy. Their echolocation, I think, is quieter or something like that. It's really interesting to see this, which is why also the noise in Puget Sound has a big influence on the southern resident killer whales, because it is some of it's in the frequency that they use, and so it's hard for them to hunt when there are ferries and other things around. That's another interesting, like the air quality thing, where we have sort of a natural experiment to see what the impact is on air quality. We're now trying to see what the lack of boat traffic on Puget Sound does to their ability to hunt. So it's an interesting experiment, and we'll see how important is sound. But as I said, there's scientific research from a number of different places in recent years that shows that the transient orcas are simply outcompeting the southern resident for Chinook and for other things, which is why their populations are actually increasing.
What carbon climate policies does the science support?
The science doesn't support any carbon policies. Economics supports carbon policies. The thing that I use is the cost to reduce 1 metric ton of CO2. So even if you agree that we should get to the 2-degree target, let's say that we take that as we must do this. It makes no sense to subsidize rooftop solar as we do, because rooftop solar costs hundreds of dollars to reduce 1 metric ton of CO2, especially in Western Washington, where the National Renewable Energy Laboratory says we are literally the worst place outside of Alaska to produce solar. So what is better is capturing methane from landfills, doing lots of other things that can cost as low as $2 a metric ton. Why would you spend $200 a metric ton when you could spend $2 a metric ton? That's an economic question where you get the most bang for your buck in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. A lot of these things that people say are scientific questions are actually economic questions. The reason that 2 degrees Celsius is a controversial target is because it costs an unbelievable amount of money. Washington State this year set CO2 reduction targets to achieve that 2-degree goal. And I testified and I said, let's say it cost $1. If I could pull $1 out of my pocket and we could achieve that goal, Would we even need this legislation? No, we would just do it. Here's $1. Nobody would fight about the science of 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees or anything. We would just say, oh, it costs $1, here's $1. Now let's say it costs $1 trillion. Well, now people are going to start arguing about whether that's the right target. But again, that argument is not about science. It's not about the 2 degrees. It is about the cost of achieving that and the trade-offs. Would you rather spend the money to achieve that 2-degree goal, or would you rather spend that money on healthcare, tax cuts, job creation, whatever else? That's the issue. And when people say I'm following the science, it's because they don't want to have that difficult discussion about priorities. They want to use science as a bludgeon against their political opponents.
I'm going to blend a couple of questions here, Todd, related to, do you come across any politicians who are scientists? And if so, are they any better than anybody else? And in your experience in government, was it your experience that the civil service outside of the political arm was more interested in following the science than, say, political leadership?
It really varies, but I'll tell you one thing that I have noticed, which is that when you ask people about their area of interest, they tend to be more honest about the trade-offs and about with science and the uncertainties and things like that. It is when this is true even for scientists, but it is when you get them out of that area that they have a difficult time assimilating all of that, and they start to make more political decisions and emphasizing the political incentives rather than the scientific realities. So I can tell you that I have talked with a lot of people who are on the left, but work in this area of environment or that area, and they will say, oh, well, I agree that we need to do this. I agree with the environmental community that we need to do this and this, but they're totally wrong in this area that I happen to be an expert and work in every day. It's not a, even scientists, economists, everybody, even within those areas have their own areas of expertise. But I have noticed that a lot of times people who live it day to day, and like I said, have that personal relationship with the incentives of that area, are more likely to be honest and candid and disagree even with their own sort of general ideological leanings when their incentives go that direction.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and that is, do you see any long-term impact to the recent kind of overnight change in policy that you referenced earlier in the broadcast from health officials, public health officials, toward one form of protest versus the other? Do you see any long-term impact on science and politics in Washington State or nationally based on the actions that we've seen over the past week and the reverse of public health officials when it comes to cautions and the coronavirus?
Right. Yeah, I think it's really bad. I think it's really bad. And what I think is so bad about it is that rather than being honest about why they're doing this, they were very arrogant about it and said, look, we're the scientists and we get to decide what's important and what's not important. So rather than just say, look, there is uncertainty in the science, and yes, this is a risk, and frankly, people may die. But personally, I think that risk is worth taking. Other people may not think the risk is worth taking. Other people may think different risks are worth taking. But I'm willing to take this risk right now because I think it's manageable. That's not what they said. What they said is, your risk is unacceptable, mine is acceptable because of science. And that is absolutely destructive. That is so horrible to pretend that science can make those decisions. And people see through it. They reckon there's no way to justify 2 weeks ago screaming at people about social distancing, right? Social distancing is this phrase that 4 months ago didn't exist, and now it's everywhere because it has been driven into us so much. And for us now to simply throw that overboard and say, oh, none of that matters as long as you're righteous, is so destructive of people's appreciation for the value of science and trust in it, and trust in the way that politicians use science. It is really awful. And it will be a long time before we recover that, if we ever do. Because now, anytime a politician says something about the science, people are just gonna say, that's nonsense, I saw what you did, which frankly is why I wrote my Wall Street Journal article about the misuse of science and why it is so despicable, because we have to hold people who play those games accountable. Otherwise, they'll keep playing those games, and the cost will be to our trust in objective metrics of science.
And don't forget, for those of you watching, the link to Todd's excellent Wall Street Journal piece is in your chat function there, as well as a couple of handouts that you can read, or at any time you can go to washingtonpolicy.org and check out our blog and see some of the great work of Todd and other center directors. We want to thank you for joining us for this special event, our virtual solution series events. Our next event is to be announced, though you can always check our events page at washingtonpolicy.org and catch up on the latest there. Thank you so much for being a part of this presentation. If you missed any part of it and you want to see it, we'll have a link to it on our YouTube or podcast formats on our Friday email. So be sure to subscribe to our Friday emails. You should anyway, but subscribe to the Friday emails and you'll see that, or to our YouTube channel, or check out our Facebook page and you'll see everything there too. Todd, thanks so much for the time, and thank you everybody for watching.